happy to welcome you to another one of my history and government discussions. I do these from time to time on a variety of topics, and I do them to try to help people to learn more about our wonderful nation and the incredible system of government that emanates from the unique Constitution that we operate under. I hope you enjoy this presentation, and please come back and watch some more when you have an opportunity. I do post them to YouTube once they are completed, and I've had a chance to edit them in a minor way at least. So I hope that you will be able to join us very often. And so here, let's get underway for today. We're going to talk about the French and Indian War, and you probably in your daily life and any kind of other world have not thought or don't think much about the French and Indian War. And in fact, it's where it all began. If there had been no French and Indian War, we probably would not have led to the United States of America that's going to come along a few years later. So we're going to take a look at this period that is basically from 1607 to 1760s. Pre-revolution. Thought was changing during this time. There were this is the Enlightenment period, the prime part of the Enlightenment period, and all through the world, new thinking is going on, and in particular, this influences what happens in North America. One of the things that is true is the early settlers basically disliked England. Many of them, that's why they had left. They were just unhappy in England or had to leave economically. America sits over here 3,000 miles or so from Europe, as well as isolated on the West Coast, but that's going to come later. England's authority gradually weakened during this period for a variety of reasons. And because America was so isolated geographically and eventually by its culture, it produced rugged and independent people, allowed the colonies to govern themselves. They made their own laws and taxes as things went by throughout the 1700s, 1600s. They produced a new civilization and a culture that is uniquely American, not at all like Great Britain, only vaguely. So one of the principles that they began to adapt is this idea of no taxation without representation. Colonial blood had been shed by the British, and it happened in the beginning of the battles, or the shedding of blood was at the Battle of Lexington and Concord, usually referred to as the shot heard round the world. It's a fascinating place to visit. I spent a week studying at Lexington and Concord, and when you walk the actual trail and you're actually in the place where Paul Revere was captured and so forth. It's just fascinating. See the bridge where all of the conflicts originally took place. It leads to the Declaration of Independence in 1776, a war of separation from Great Britain, and finally, by 1787, the writing of the US Constitution, and in 1789, the launching of the new nation. So as with many things in human nature, you follow the money. Follow the money. What was the motivation? What was behind everything that was happening during this period? One of the ideas that they believed in strongly is that wealth is power. The key to wealth is to export more than to import. And so they used a process or a theory of economics that's called the mercantile theory. Mercantilism is an economic policy that wealth is power, and the key to wealth is to export more than to import. They basically believed there was only pretty much so much wealth in the world, and you needed to put it in your own bank account in order to become wealthy. The European countries competed for world power and needed colonies to provide necessary raw materials. The colonies' role was to provide those raw materials so the mother country did not have to import from other nations, and they provided markets. Once something is manufactured, here was a place to sell it, and they owned that particular market. Favorable balance of trade for England in the process. European nations relied on strong central governments to enforce mercantile doctrines. The Americans helped the British maintain naval supremacy by providing ships, ship stores, sailors, trade, the enumerated commodities, for example. And Americans would then provided profitable markets for the English manufactured goods. We would take all this raw material, the wood and the grain that was grown and the tobacco and the cotton, we'd ship it off to Great Britain and it would be manufactured into other products and then be sent back to the United States for sale. Americans discouraged from buying these goods from other countries. They just weren't supposed to do that. Don't buy anything that's French or Spanish or Dutch when you can buy it from us who are in England. The most famous of laws to enforce mercantilism were the navigation laws promulgated in about 1650. What they did is they restricted trade to the English vessels, not allowing any Dutch. Now, why do I say Dutch? Well, at that time, the Dutch were the most prominent bankers and traders in the world, other than the English. And so you couldn't use their ships, or the French or the Spanish for that matter. Well, not so many Spanish. Additional laws. Goods bound for colonies first had to go to England for duties. So think about how inefficient that is. You put something together, you have tobacco, for example, that you grow in Virginia. In order to sell it in France or Netherlands or anywhere in the world, you had to ship it to England first, where they would charge duties, and then it could go on to the other country. The colonists were not allowed to manufacture certain products to not compete with the British. There was no iron manufacture. There were no axes. There were no axles. There were no other things like that that were manufactured in the United States. So what's so good about the mercantile theory? Well, first of all, it encourages the complete development of all natural resources. There's money to be made. And so they went out and they cut down all the forest in order to provide, for example, the masts for the ships. The old forest of North America was beautiful and had these tall, unadulterated trees. And so they would use those for masts and the great ships of the world. And there were many other things as well. Encourages trade deficits for foreign nations. The goal of mercantilism is to build wealth, which means any opportunity to do so is encouraged. And raw materials were a hot commodity, not only for Britain, but also for the other countries. And in the process, it reduced the unemployment rates. Nobody in North America should have been without a job during this period. And cultural exchanges are encouraged because the foundation encourages things to happen over international boundaries. Lots of cultural exchanges occur. And in the process, standards of living arise. So what's so bad about it? Well, it creates high levels of resentment. There is, in this trickle-down economics, which works on paper, it just doesn't work well in life thanks to inherent greed that so many people have. Once you get hold of some money, you don't let it trickle down. It creates a preference for the mother nation to always be first. They really begin to treat the colonies as foreign countries. And the colonies were forced to sell their raw materials at a bargain basement price. Whereas maybe if they'd been in a free market, maybe the Dutch would have paid more. Maybe the French would have paid more. Maybe those people from Russia even would have paid more. And there is a limit to raw materials. For example, the old forest of the North eventually began to get cut over. And finally, the system is ultimately quite inefficient. It is not the way to run an economy. So then let's look some more pros and cons. It's a system that's largely out of practice. I don't know of a place in the world that's really practicing mercantilism anymore. High risk. During this period, the principal benefit of foreign trade was the importation of gold and silver. The whole idea is the more gold and the more silver that you put in the bank, you put in your treasury, the better off, the more wealthy your nation is going to be. And that's how the Spanish became wealthy. They extracted all kinds of wealth in terms of gold and silver from Latin America. And It actually be the principal benefit of foreign trade was the importation of gold and silver, yes, but for nations, therefore, they were almost constantly on the verge of war. Draining one another's valuable gold and silver was thought to be almost as desirable as the benefits of trade. So if you get them to expend their money for armies, then you're going to drain them so that then you're in a better position. So it's fair to ask, okay, if we don't practice mercantile theory today, what do we use? Well, it comes out of the mind of a Scotsman by the name of Adam Smith. He writes a very famous book called The Wealth of Nations, and he publishes it. I always thought this was coincidental to the founding of the United States. It's published in 1776. It's considered even today to be the foundation of modern economic theory. And he criticized mercantilistic doctrines. He demonstrated that trade, when freely initiated, benefits both parties. Second, he argued that specialization results in efficiency and growth. And finally, he argued that the mercantilism was harmful to the general population. And on the other hand, laissez-faire or free markets, which originated with Smith, interpreted economic welfare in a far wider sense. And so people all benefited from it. Now, we are going to live in the United States under almost exclusively laissez-faire all the way through the 19th century and into the early 20th century. However, by that time, various businesses had become so large and so abusive that finally the government has to be a referee and step in and begin to control some of the things that happen. And so we do not have an exclusively laissez-faire economy anymore. So the Navigation Acts, 1650, said no country could trade with colonies unless the goods were shipped in either colonial or English ships. All vessels had to be operated with crews that were at least 3/4 English or colonial. The colonies could export certain products only to England. And almost all goods traded between the colonies and Europe first had to pass through an English port. And so we have this, this was it responsible for English to pass laws such as these to control trade? I don't think so. It was difficult for Great Britain to enforce these laws because of the distance. And the colonists broke the law and smuggled and traded with other countries. It was impossible in that vast Atlantic Ocean to really be an effective police force, even though England had the greatest navy in the world during that time. Advantages, especially good for those people in the tobacco market in Virginia, Maryland. The rights of English, but some self-government, no taxes to support the army, navy to protect them. Great Britain, or United Kingdom, was providing the protection for all of the colonies. They didn't have armies, they didn't have navies, and yet they had to be protected. And so they had their own self-government, but they had no way of really participating. Until 1763, the navigation laws weren't a particular burden because they were laxly enforced. This is a term that's called salutary neglect. Salutary neglect. The merchants disregarded or evaded restrictions. Some got rich by smuggling. Famously, the man who signs with his big signature the Declaration of Independence, John Hancock, how did he make his fortune? He was a smuggler, pure and simple. The average American was better off economically than the average Englishman. Now, there was a huge upper crust at Great Britain, but compared to the average person in Great Britain, better off to have been in America those days. The disadvantages of mercantilism is stifled economic initiative, and it favored the South due to their production of tobacco and sugar and rice. Parliament set up a board of trade with admiralty courts. It took away the right of trial by jury. It took away the right of trial by jury, and you were considered guilty until proven innocent. How was that for a concept? Most important, mercantilism was insulting. The colonies felt they were being milked like cows. The British failed to see that the United States was an emerging nation. This is still early in the idea of nationhood. Nationhood, as we understand it, where there are definite borders and economies and populations and so forth, is a concept that didn't really solidify until maybe around 1500 or so. There were different city-states, and there were different areas of authority, and there were what amount to basically warlords, but true nationhood doesn't come until that time. So what is this thing, salutary neglect? It's the period after the Glorious Revolution, and what made it glorious? Glorious because no blood was shed. 1688, in which Parliament strengthened the Navigation Acts and toughened the regulation of colonial trade. Smuggling trials were held in stricter royal courts, and a board of trade was established to monitor trade. However, the reality was that the British control actually decreased. They didn't care. As long as raw materials went to England and the colonists bought British goods, the British did not enforce the Navigation Act. In other words, follow the money. Who's getting rich? In fact, the policy benefited both parties, which is why it's been given the name salutary neglect. Some reasons why the non-policy worked is there was an inherent loyalty to the British crown. People in the United States really wanted to do the right thing by the King of England. The people consider themselves to be loyal British subjects, and that's going to continue on through the 1760s, even though there's a lot of conflict beginning to emerge. It takes until past 1770 before they begin to see themselves as breaking away. And there was a lack of communication. It took a long time, took maybe 30, 40 days at best to send a ship back and forth across the Atlantic Ocean. And there were no electronic communications. And as time went by, more and more societal and cultural differences across the Atlantic. Here is a list of the enumerated commodities, lumber, tobacco, rice, indigo, and furs, all going to England. Now, this is a complicated map, and I'm not going to spend too much time on it, but we talk about the triangular trade. And as you can see, the triangular trade wasn't a pure triangle. It had things going in many different directions. The one part here that's not really shown is that, we think of the slaves as coming into the Americas, and yes, there were tens of thousands, millions of slaves who were brought into the Americas. About 40 to 45% of them went to Brazil, 40 to 45% of them went to the West Indies, and maybe only about 10% of them came to North America. But one of the things not mentioned in slavery is there were huge numbers of slaves that were imported into Europe, Portugal in particular. But anyway, you see how these products were going in all kinds of different directions. Now, that's a complicated map, and I don't want you to focus too much on it. But here is a little simpler map. It shows from England to the colonies, furniture, clothing, colonials had few factories, and so they manufactured things. So you see manufactured goods, the red line, going to the Americas, tobacco, indigo, flour, and lumber going to Great Britain, manufactured goods going to the West Indies. You see the slaves coming into North America. Again, it's a sort of a triangle, but kind of hard, you have to visualize it a little bit. So here's another version of the triangular trade. And it shows which direction rum and slaves and sugar and molasses and so forth all go. You get an idea of what had to go back and forth. Tobacco, fish, lumber, cotton, textiles, manufactured goods back and forth between the colonies and the mother country. And then here's the simplest of the triangular trade. Basically says that sugar, tobacco, cotton go to Europe, textiles, rum, and manufactured goods go to Africa, and slaves go to America. Well, it wasn't quite that simple as you saw in the earlier maps here, but the idea is there was a triangular trade. It was actually a quadrangular trade because the Caribbean was almost its own trading area, and the United States another leg of that. And here's one more look at the triangular trade. And of course, it was the Middle Passage that brought all these African Americans into the Americas. About 12% of those who were captured and made into slaves coming out of West Africa died before they ever got to the Americas, about 12%. It was a terrible practice. It was the most inhumane thing we can all possibly imagine. And our legacy comes down to us today from that happening. So here we see that the French were not here to take over the land and colonize, as were the British. The British were colonizing. They wanted to establish really small Great Britons, if you would, whereas the French had entirely different ideas. They set up trading posts for the fur trade and developed working relationships with the Indian tribes, unlike the British. The British pretty much did not work with the Indians at all, forced them to leave their lands if they didn't kill them, whereas the French intermarried with them. You may all recall that I was a superintendent of schools in northern Minnesota, and we had little pieces of 2 Indian reservations that were part of our school district. And again, many of those Indians actually still have French names, coming down this legacy of mixing with the French a couple hundred years ago. So anyway, and why was this fur so important? Well, it happened that in Europe during this period, the fur, like particularly the beaver, became very fashionable. And so the more you could bring, it was very valuable. So the French got a foothold in Canada. They were late coming to the party. They established themselves at Quebec. Samuel de Champlain did that. They established the fur trade with the beaver pelts in particular. They had friendly relations with the Huron tribe. They joined the Hurons in battle against the Iroquois Federation, who in future hampered French settlement and allies of the British. The government of New France, however, unlike the British, which still in the colonies, they each did have their own colonial government. That wasn't true in Canada. Whoever was there was directly under the control of the king. So New France was more than double the size of the British colonies, but much less populated. British were more interested in bringing settlers from the mother country. The French wanted to make the native Indians into French citizens, and they tended to treat the Indians as equals and intermarried. And the British rarely intermarried with Indians. The French were more interested in exploiting the new lands economically, and they had these alliances with the Indians. So 1688 to 1763, there are going to be six colonial wars, 4 world wars. 4 of them are world wars with England, France, Spain, and all involved American colonists. First 2 wars, King William's War, Queen Anne's War. French and Indians, later Spain and England. In this case, there were no regular troops involved. These were all colonial troops or Indians allied with each other on either side. Now remember, you don't need to remember all of this, but I'm going to go through these wars just so you could get an idea. This is a fighting period of world history. Fight, 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 war, 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 one after the other. King William's War is in the latter part of the 1600s. Second Indian War, sometimes called Father Baudoin's War, Castine's War, and it's a North American theater of the 9 Years' War, also known as the War of the Grand Alliance or the War of the League of Augsburg, the first of 6 colonial wars. And here you see a whole list of them. I'm not going to go through and read all of this, but you see there were a lot of wars, one after the other. Most of them fought really between people who were already here rather than regular troops being sent in. The Treaty of Ryswick, 1697, ended the war, but this is the end, and they go status quo ante bellum. You know what that means? That's Latin for the current situation. We'll go back to the situation before the war. That's where the colonial borders went. And the peace did not last long. Within 5 years, the colonies were embroiled in the next phase called the Queen Anne's War. Why is it called King William's? Because the war starts when King William is the king. Why is it called Queen Anne's War? It starts when Queen Anne is the British monarch. And there's the second of the series leading up to the French and Indian War. It's generally viewed as the American theater of the War of Spanish Succession. And it's usually in North America viewed as a standalone conflict, and then it has its ramifications as something different. The War of Spanish Succession was an early part of the 18th century by the death of the childless Charles II of Spain. He couldn't find a girlfriend. Established the principle that dynastic rights were secondary to maintaining the balance of power. Related conflicts. So you thought I'd mentioned all the possible wars. Well, we have the Great Northern War, Rákóczi's War of Independence in Hungary, another one in France, and so forth. And one off in India, too. They're fighting there as well. And we have all these conflicts going on, and they're all trying to weaken each other. They're all trying to get a step up. They're all trying to make a lot of money, and it's all part of that. Now, you need to kind of keep in perspective here that throughout the 1500s and 1600s, Spain was the most powerful nation in the world. And that all changes in the Spanish Armada being defeated. And from that point forward, Spain enters into gradual decline, losing by the 19th century all of its colonies. But by 1700, they're still a major global power. They have the Spanish Netherlands, they have parts of Italy and Philippines, and of course all the nations that are in Americas. And we have this succession thing that's a continual problem among the monarchs of Europe. And this is still believing that monarchs are descended from God or anointed by God. Louis XIV of France, William III of England are trying to partition the empire, and the Spanish are imposed to them. We get all of these names and all of these battles, and we're not talking about European war here, so I don't want to dwell on this too much. Finally, we have the Grand Alliance, England, the Dutch Republic, and the Holy Roman Empire on the other side of France and Spain. And these alliances are very fluid. They'll last for a while, and then they change and they go to another place. The French held the advantage in the early stages, but were eventually forced into defensive positions, and by 1710, the Allies had failed to make significant progress. When the Emperor Joseph first died, Archduke Charles succeeded his brother as emperor, and new peace talks take place. So we have the Treaty of Utrecht and these other two treaties, which are really similar, just settling the same war in different theaters. The Treaty of Utrecht is important because it showed English victory. This is the important one of all of these that I've mentioned, because in it, England is given Nova Scotia, Newfoundland, and Hudson's Bay. And primarily, the benefit here is the fishing lands that are involved. A generation of peace followed, and of course, more salutary neglect. Finally, in 1739, we have this odd thing called the War of Jenkins' Ear. The War of Jenkins' Ear, which is England versus Spain. It's all fought in the Caribbean, some near Georgia. And eventually it merges into the King George's War, also called the War of Austrian Succession. France is allied with Spain. New England colonials capture Louisburg or Louisburg. In 1748, the peace treaty gives Louisburg back to the French. The colonials remain angry at the Old World diplomats. War of Jenkins' Ear. Now, it isn't even called that at the time. It's a 10-year war. It's fought mostly in South America and in the West Indies of the Caribbean Sea. Pretty much it's over by 1742. Where does this name come from? Nobody was calling it that in the 1740s, or 50s, or 1700s at all. It's finally coined by a British historian, Thomas Carlyle, in 1858. And he refers to a Robert Jenkins, who's a captain of a British merchant ship, and his ear had been cut off by sailors of the Spanish Coast Guard when they boarded his ship to search for contraband. 7 years later, in support of mongering for war, Jenkins was paraded before the British Parliament without his ear. So it becomes known as this odd thing, the War of Jenkins' Ear. And so what was the casus belli, which is the cause of the war? Well, supposedly it was the maiming of Jenkins following the boarding of his vessel by the Spanish. Popular response didn't amount to much in the beginning. And finally, the British want to stir up problems, and so they hope to get outrage against Spain, believing a victorious war would improve Britain's trading situation in the Caribbean. And they wanted to keep pressure on Spain to honor their lucrative Asiento contract, which gave the British slave traders permission to sell slaves. And slave means the place of, or sorry, Asiento means the location where it's happening. Anyway, keep going with this tedious part of it. The British attacks on the Spanish possessions in Central America resulted in high casualties, primarily from disease. After 1742, it was subsumed by the wider War of the Austrian Succession. And finally, in 1748, we get some peace. Okay, now we get to North America, 1750. All of this stuff is a prelude to what's going to happen in North America, really pretty much beginning in the 1750s. Sorry for all of that pre-explanation. But here you see the claims that are taking place in North America as of 1750. There had been a large grant to the Hudson's Bay Company, which is going to trade for furs. And it's going to establish a lot of trading posts all through this area. New France exists to the north, basically around the St. Lawrence River, and Louisiana exists, almost all considered to be near New Orleans and a little bit north of that. Very little settlement in Spanish Florida yet at that point. British colonies are confined mostly to the east side of the Appalachian Mountains, and there is some disputed territory as well. Now, you understand, nobody's seen this country. Nobody's been in most of it. It's wilderness. You have trees and many of these rivers. No human being has ever been, other than Indians, no human has ever been on them. So finally, there's something that's called the Albany Plan. The Albany Plan. And the Albany Plan is from the first places where Benjamin Franklin emerges in history as a significant person. It's convened by the British. It's led by Benjamin Franklin, who was already a well-respected and prestigious person, but not as major as he's going to be later on. It's the first attempt at colonial unity, but only 7 of 13 colonies are there. The purpose was to keep the Iroquois loyal, bolster defense against France through colonial unity. Franklin sponsored the plan for colonial home rule unanimously adopted by the delegates. The colonies, however, rejected it. Not enough independence for us. London then rejected too much independence. So it dies, sort of. This conference was called the Albany Conference because it was held in Albany, New York, just a few miles north of New York City. Only 7 of 13 colonies came, and yet there are 8 parts of the serpent or the snake, so I'm not sure how they did that. The purposes were to get the Iroquois to fight with the British and to get greater colonial unity. And so this is where I think of this as one of the first cartoons ever drawn, political cartoons. It was drawn by Benjamin Franklin, and you see the different parts of it there. And it's join or die. It's trying to make the point. So what were the results? The Albany delegates adopted it. It was rejected by the colonies and by the British. Thought it didn't give enough independence and too much independence. Early on, war battles do not go well for the British. And finally, by 1755, General Braddock is sent, and he's going to die. We'll mention more about that in a second. Now, this is interesting to compare. From the Albany Plan of Union in 1754, and then the Constitution of 1787, we find there are similarities, that the president is given certain responsibilities, and that with the consent of the Senate, make treaties, provide 2/3 senators present concur, and so there's similar provisions. Make such laws as necessary, regulate commerce with the foreign nations, raise and pay soldiers, raise and support armies. And they have the power to tax and make laws. have the power to tax and like laws. So there was an influence that took place here. So the French and Indian War, or 7 Years' War, which was a huge battle to fight for the control of North America. English-French rivalry eventually becomes worldwide. The war begins over land disputes in the Ohio Valley. The British want the fur trade and 2 openings into North America. England and the 13 colonies fight together to defend their empire, which they'd never been done before, against the French Indian allies and the Spanish. And remarkably, George Washington, a young man from Virginia, starts this war. He starts the French and Indian War. So comparing sides, the allies. England had the Iroquois, which was really a confederation of 5 and later 6 tribes. France has the Algonquins, the Hurons, and the Ottawas. The colonial population of England during this early period was about 1.5 million. France, only 70,000. Colonial activities, the English were establishing towns, trade, farms, very domestic. France was involved in fur trading, and missionary priests followed them wherever they went to convert the heathens to God. The first clash in the Ohio Valley, the British versus the French. And this is where Fort Necessity is established by George Washington. The French operate out of Fort Duquesne, which later will become Pittsburgh. Delaware and Shawnee Indians are working with. British decide, doggone it, it's time to get rid of these French. Get them out of there. It's our territory. We want it. So we want them out of there. So General Edward Braddock was sent to evict the French from the Ohio Valley and Canada and Newfoundland and Nova Scotia, in other words. This is a General Braddock. And he attacks in the Ohio Valley, Mohawk Valley, and Acadia, which is up in Canada, Newfoundland, Nova Scotia. He's killed, unfortunately, 10 miles from the French fort of Duquesne by 1,500 French and Indian forces, and some of his officers as well. Only British success is it eventually expels France from Louisiana. So these Cajuns are something we should take just a second to make a note about. These are French colonists who settled the Canadian maritime provinces of Nova Scotia and New Brunswick in the 1600s. And their region was sometimes called Acadia, and they were Acadians. By 1745, the British wanted to get them out of there because they would not pledge allegiance to the King of England. And they refused. So they also didn't want to join the British in fighting against the Indians, who were their allies and relatives. And so the British expelled them. This eventually becomes known as Le Grand Dérangement, or Great Upheaval of 1755. And so where do they go? They go to New Orleans, basically, or south of New Orleans, and that's where they have descendants to this day. The war in 1756 is finally declared, and it is Lord Loudoun, who's in Virginia at this point, and Marquis de Calme, who's in Quebec. Native American tribes exploited both sides. They worked them against each other. So what kind of fighting did they do? The colonials followed Indian-style guerrilla fighting. The British marched in formation with bayonet charges and so forth. Their organization, colonial militias, served under their own captains. The British officers wanted to take charge of the colonials. There was very little military deference or protocols observed by the colonials. The British were drills and tough and disciplined. The finances, they were resistant to raising taxes in the colonies, and the British felt the colonists should pay for their own defense. And the demeanor, casual, non-professional, prima donnas, and so forth. Very different. William Pitt becomes the foreign minister and understood colonial concerns, and he offers them a compromise. For colonial loyalty and military cooperation, the British would reimburse the colonials for their assemblies for their costs. Lord Loudoun would be removed, and colonial morale increased by 1758. And so the tide turns for England eventually. Spain had become an ally of France by this time. Now, what's the significance? Well, here we see where the fighting was taking place. It was on the shores of Lake Erie. It is up and down the rivers. Now, you know that the Allegheny and the Monongahela rivers come together at Fort Pitt, which is today Pittsburgh, to form the Ohio River. Here you see, this is where the big fighting was taking place. They were important. Waterways were the transportation route for most things during this time. Both countries built forts to defend their claims. And then we have a fort is constructed by George Washington. Now, this is a replica of it. It's been recreated. Of course, the original disappeared, but it was pretty primitive. There wasn't much to this. Washington, unfortunately, did not do a good job of putting it in a very advantageous site. And it was pretty swampy and not a smart thing to do. But that was George Washington's effort. The British were concerned about French forts in the British. And so Washington is sent as a major in the Virginia militia to the Allegheny River Valley. He's only about 21 years old. He leads 300 men against the French at Fort Duquesne, and he kills over 100 French. Along the way, he builds this thing you saw in the previous picture, Fort Necessity, and the French defeat him soundly. A British statesman later wrote about Washington's first skirmish. The volley fired by a young Virginian in the backwoods of America set the world on fire. Now, Washington says himself, I fortunately escaped without any wound. And then at the end, he says, I heard the bullets whistle, and believe me, there's something charming in the sound. The first skirmish was at this place called Jumonville Glen. Washington and the Indian allies attacked a French position there. 10 were killed, 21 wounded. A few days later, the French retaliated and Washington surrendered Fort Necessity. He became involved in controversy because the surrender document written by the interpreter incorrectly deemed the French diplomats instead of combatants, making Washington therefore a murderer. British attacked Fort Duquesne the next year in 1755, and this is under General Braddock. Braddock, 1,500 men. They were confident they could take the fort, but they were ambushed outside the gates by the French and their natives, the Native Americans. And during the battle, Braddock and his staff were killed, but not Washington. As he lives, he has fate is ahead of him. The British defeat at Fort Duquesne was the only first of many losses suffered during this early period, 55 to 56. William Pitt. French were initially victorious. King George picks Pitt to be the new prime minister. He puts together a massive army of 50,000 men, but had to borrow a lot of money in order to do it. And this is, by the way, is a picture of the Golden Triangle. The two rivers you see coming together, I can't remember which one is which, but one's the Allegheny and one's the Monongahela, and they come together, and then to your left, it will be the Ohio River that goes on out to the Mississippi River. And this is another view of the Golden Triangle, as it's called today, in Pittsburgh. Now, I only show this map to show water, because the way you had to move from one place to the other was by river or ocean. It was very difficult to navigate across land. You could do it, but you had to chop down a lot of trees, and you could move troops. But if you had to move cannon or anything else, it was just very difficult. So the effects of the war. The French lose the war, and do with it all of their land, all of their claims in North America. The English inherit vast new land holdings in North America. And Great Britain accumulates huge, huge war debts. The colonists now realize that the British are not invincible, and they will later seek independence. England sees responsibility to defend empire in the North America, and King George and Parliament begin to tax the colonies. This is Mr. Pitt again, Prime Minister. Helps turn the tide in 1758. He made peace with the important Indian allies. In September 1759, General James Wolfe leads a surprise attack on Quebec, and both General Wolfe on one side and Montcalm on the other are both killed at the Battle of Quebec. British victory, Fort Niagara cut off the French frontier forts, and therefore it leads England to eventually win the war. It's settled in the 1763 Treaty of Paris. In that treaty, France lost her Canadian possessions, most of her empire in India, and claims to lands east of the Mississippi. Spain got all the French lands west of the Mississippi, New Orleans, but lost Florida to England. They're going to get it back later, but England got all of the French lands in Canada, exclusive rights to the Caribbean, and so forth. So it's a big victory for the British. So here we see how the claims now look by 1763. If you can remember back to how it looked in 1750 with an earlier map, see how it's now shifted around. Effects of the war on Britain: increased her colonial empire, enlarged her debt. Britain's contempt for the colonials created bitter feelings. Therefore, England felt a major reorganization of her American empire was necessary. So it united the colonials against a common enemy for the first time, a specialized experience for the colonials, and it created bitter feelings that would not go away. Spanish and the Indians were weakened. Spain was removed from Florida, but was going to get it back in 1783. This shifts back and forth over time. Although still controlling New Orleans, Louisiana, and western half of present-day U.S. Indians lost their most powerful tool, the ability to play off the rival powers against each other, and they were very skilled at doing that, working the French against the British. The Indians would now have to negotiate exclusively with the British. So we have to mention here that this was only part of the 7 Years' War, which was taking place in Europe and in Asia, mostly in India. French and Indian War was essentially the North American theater of a much larger conflict, the 7 Years' War, sometimes called the First True World War. Britain, Prussia, and Hanover fought against an alliance of France, Austria, Saxony, Russia, Sweden, and Spain. Now, if you notice all these wars, is it any wonder that by the time we get to the time the United States is actually founded, we are told by Washington to avoid entangling foreign conflicts, and we do pretty much for future, which we can do because of the ocean that keeps us separated from them. But we were very tired of all the constant wars in Europe. The war lasts from 1757 to 1763 in Europe. 1763 was, in fact, a turning point in British colonial relationships. King George III is on the throne, and he's instrumental in ending the French and Indian War. He's a strong supporter of taxing the colonies, opposed any compromise, and then eventually, when he's lost the colonies, his government sort of sidelines him a little bit because he's gradually losing his mind. By the time we get beyond 1800, he really is pretty much an imbecile. He has a disease, among other things, called porphyry, I believe I'm pronouncing it correctly, in which, if I could be graphic, he has blue poop. But anyway, that's another story to talk about at a different time. So we have, this is the way it lays out after 1763, the treaty. And interestingly, some of the colonies are claiming lands that are in the old Northwest, Virginia, Massachusetts, Connecticut, and so forth. The Indian attacks forced the British to build forts to protect the settlers moving westward. More money, you see. Expense, expense, expense. Got to mention Pontiac's rebellion. He's an Ottawa leader, a very skilled one. And they have many attacks by the Indians, many, many battle sites that take place in this period, the 1760s. The colonists moved into this territory, causing the Indian attacks on their settlements. They didn't want them to be there, and so they went after them with a vengeance. Great Britain would prohibit the colonists from moving westward. They said, you cannot go across this certain line, which is basically the Appalachian Mountains. You may not settle. You cannot go west. You're forbidden. Well, you don't tell Americans that then or now. The British troop movements in response to Chief Pontiac's resistance to negotiate, notice they're all over the place. They're big battalions and companies, and they're fighting in many different places, pretty much one side or the other of the Great Lakes and the St. Lawrence River. England's solutions: pass a series of tax laws that have the colonists help pay back the debt. Pass law restricting colonists from moving westward. Keep the British troops in North America to stop the Indian attacks, and stop the smuggling by enforcing the Navigation Acts. And this is so Proclamation of 1763, they wanted to temporarily keep them off of the Indian land until they could negotiate with them. But people like Daniel Boone, most famously, defied the proclamation and crossed the Appalachians and began to settle outright. They believed it was their birthright. It belonged to them. The American dream could be found out west. So we have this conflict between virtual representation, which the British advocated, that they had given that virtual representation. Didn't matter if the colonies didn't elect members, they were being represented by the other members of Parliament. Not all citizens in Great Britain were represented in Parliament either. The British Parliament pledged to represent every person. The Americans represented and resented virtual representation. The colonists governed themselves. They've been doing that since the early 1600s. They had their own direct representation. They understood how that worked. They were not opposed to paying taxes because they were already paying taxes locally. They just objected to sending them off to London. And they wanted, if one wonders what would have happened if the Parliament had actually granted representation. So George Grenville now is a prime minister, and he comes up with a series of programs. The Sugar Act of 1764, Current Act, also say Currency Act in the same year, Quartering Act the same next year, and the famous and infamous Stamp Act that's going to really make a difference. The Sugar Act. Britain acquired huge debts, and this was to pay them off. They were going to raise money, new rules to enforce the act, and smuggling cases were to be tried in Britain by a judge and not a jury. The judges received commissions on illegal cargoes and fines. Very, very bad act. The Quartering Act was bad, but not quite as onerous. They had required the people to provide housing for the British troops who remained. Some complained, but mostly went along with it. But it is the Stamp Act that is egregious. 1765, it was a tax on most newspapers, legal documents, and most printed material. Now, this is a direct tax. Now, when you go and buy gasoline, you buy it for a gross amount at the pump. You don't think about the tax amount because the tax is built into it. On the other hand, there are some taxes you pay. Your real estate tax, for example, is a direct tax. You have to actually write out a check for it. Well, this is one where they could see how much they were paying. And it was very obnoxious to them. And it was to raise money. And here's an example of what the stamp looked like. Stamp Act crisis. In October, delegates from 9 colonies met as the Stamp Act Congress, organized by James Otis. They objected to no taxation without representation, and they sent petitions off to King and Parliament. And now the merchants begin to boycott British goods. Remember that the colonies are a market for all these things, and an important one because they have a large population. British merchants were angered, and groups were organized in the colonies now. And no one was going to sell stamps in America. By 1766, they had created such a crisis that Parliament repealed the Stamp Act, but the anger remained. So some theories of representation. Was the extent of Parliament's authority over the colonies absolute, or was it limited? How could the colonies give or withhold consent for parliamentary legislation when they did not have representation in that body? Power to tax is the power to destroy. If you have the power to tax, you have the power to take all of their wealth from them. If there is no check upon the people who possess the power to tax, then they have all the power to destroy. Colonists wanted an actual representative elected from them to address their concerns to Parliament. If a politician wants to have power, he needs votes of the people who elect him. He has to live among those people so he will not use his power to destroy them, or the people may in turn vote him out of out of power, or worse, destroy him. Man's nature is greedy, therefore he cannot be trusted with unchecked power. Power tends to corrupt. Absolute power corrupts absolutely, first said by Lord Acton. And it's very true. Restless colonials, higher confidence in their military ability, but contempt for the British. Washington, by the way, is demoted as a result of all of these activities. And one of the reasons he leaves the military, we believe, and then does not return until the Revolutionary War. The British are concerned by the disloyalty of American shippers. Many colonies refused to provide money or troops for war. The colonists wanted the rights of Englishmen, but not the responsibilities. Intercolonial disunity had continued throughout the war. Distance, religion, ethnicity, class, but participants in the war had found a commonality. People of destiny. While there was a French presence, it had forced the colonists to stay close to the British. With the French gone, there was no need to hang on to the British. Spanish threat was lessened. There were no influence left in Florida, for example. The Indian threat is lessened. The Iroquois and Creeks, hurt by the Treaty of Paris, could not play powers off against each other. Americans felt betrayed, defied proclamation, had bad sign for future of royal power. The war gave the colonials a sense of destiny to conquer the continent. Are these the first hints of our imperialism, which is called manifest destiny, our ability, our right to take over the entire continent of North America? Yes, I think they were. Winning the French and Indian War gave the British confidence, heavy hand to use towards the colonies. And now the stage is set for conflict. It's only going to increase as time goes by. And it is the end of this part of the story. But all I'm trying to say is that all of this activity, all of these miscellaneous wars and all of these strife and so forth, while each one of them was pretty meaningless and pretty small in and of itself, each one is a progressive step towards creating the conditions that will allow and actually mandate the separation of the people who are colonists from the mother country of United Kingdom. Okay, so it is the end, but of course we know that this was only the beginning.